best known for his political work Leviathan. A.P. Martinich has written a biography of Thomas Hobbes, which examines the contributions to Hobbes's beliefs on life, nature, and politics. Mr. Martinich spoke at the University of Texas, where he teaches philosophy. His talk lasts about an hour.
Well, I'm pleased to introduce to you today my friend and colleague Al Martinich of the Department of Philosophy, a specialist in the history of modern philosophy and philosophy of language. Professor Martinich has been at the University of Texas since 1973 and has written or edited 9 books in that period. His book, Communication and Reference, appeared in 1984, and he is the editor of the dominant textbook in philosophy of language, a book from which I learned and have since taught, the aptly titled The Philosophy of Language, from Oxford University Press, which will go into its 4th edition next year. He and I are now co-editing 2 volumes for Blackwell Publishers. One's called A Companion to Analytic Philosophy, and the other is Analytic Philosophy, an anthology. In connection with Hobbes, about whom he will talk to us today, Professor Martinich has translated Part 1 of De Corpore, that was in 1981, and he has written several books, most recently Hobbes, a biography, with Cambridge University Press, but also The Two Gods of Leviathan in 1992, A Hobbes Dictionary in 1995, and Thomas Hobbes from St. Martin's Press in 1997. So, Al Martinich.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be talking to you today. Let me begin by putting Hobbes's life into a broad context. He was born in Malmesbury, about 80 miles west of London and about 20 miles east of Bristol. The year was 1588, and the Spanish Armada was about to set sail for England. He died at Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire in 1679, not too many years before the Glorious Revolution. So he was born at one of England's darkest moments and died just as it was setting a bright course for constitutional monarchy. He lived 91 years. Since many people thought he was an atheist, they were baffled and disturbed that God would have let him live so long and so well. It was fortunate both for Hobbes and for us that he did live longer than average, because his first great work of philosophy, De Cive, on the Citizen, was published when he was 54. And Leviathan, the greatest work of political philosophy in English, was published in 1651 when he was 63. What was his life like? Today, most people tend to think that it was just like he said life was like in the state of nature: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, his life was almost the complete opposite. We already know that it wasn't short. It wasn't solitary either. He had a lot of friends in England and Europe, but he outlived virtually all of them. His life began poor, but from the age of 20 onwards, he lived comfortably, often in the houses of some of the richest people in England. When he died, he was worth about £1,000. That's the equivalent of 10 years' salary or more. His life was not brutish, if that means not being cultured. He lived most of his life in major cities, especially London and Paris, and associated with scholars, scientists, nobles, and even a king. Oh, I haven't mentioned nasty. His life did have a bit of nastiness in it, especially in the 1650s and 60s. He battled with some of the leading scientists, mathematicians, and religious leaders of the time. That's the general context of Hobbes's life. Now I want to go back to the beginning and fill in the details. He was born in Wiltshire in southwest England. His mother gave birth to him prematurely because she was afraid of the Spanish threat. He said that he was born a twin. Fear was his brother. He took an odd kind of pride in being a coward. When he fled England in 1640 because he smelled civil war in the air, he said that he was, quote, the first of those who fled. I think he was a physical coward, but intellectually courageous. His father was a minister, but not a good one. He could read the texts used in worship service, but not much else. And he was neither nice nor responsible. One Saturday, he was drinking and playing cards so long into the night that the next day he couldn't stay awake during the worship service. His congregation heard him mutter in his sleep, "Clubs are Trump." And there's worse to be told. The father got into an argument with another minister, Richard Jean. The father called Jean, quote, a knave, and an errant knave, and a drunken knave. Jean sued and won. The father was declared, quote, contumacious and excommunicate, and ordered to do public penance. He refused. Instead, he went after Jean in the churchyard, punched him, quote, under the ear or about the head, and stroked off his hat, and made him let fall his cloak from his back. As a result, Hobbes's father fled Malmesbury and reportedly went to London. In any case, that's the last we hear of the father. It's hard to know whether these incidents occurred just before or just after Hobbes went off to Oxford. My best guess is that Hobbes was already away at school. In any case, I suspect that the adolescent Hobbes, he was 14 when he went to Magdalen Hall, was embarrassed by his father's behavior. Hobbes had a good time during his years at Oxford, probably 1602 through 1608. He says that he enjoyed catching jackdaws at dawn and visiting bookshops where he would pore over the world maps. He was especially intrigued by the areas marked terra incognita. I haven't said much about his education at Oxford, and he doesn't say much. He makes fun of his logic teacher, who was quite solemn, but too young to grow a beard. There were set ways of determining whether a syllogism was valid, but Hobbes says that he preferred to prove things in his own way. This was a trait that never left him, and we'll see later that it got him into trouble. Still, he must have been a good and respectable student, because the principal of Magdalen Hall recommended him to the powerful Cavendish family of Derbyshire. The person who first made that family great was Elizabeth Hardwick. She's better known as Bess the Builder, and I'll call her Bess in order to keep her distinct from her friend Queen Elizabeth. I want to devote a couple of minutes to Bess because she's a fascinating figure and because her life nicely shows how some powerful families got that way. Bess became one of the richest people in England through 4 judicious marriages. First, she married her cousin, who died shortly later. But don't feel sorry for her, because the inheritance gave her startup money for a second marriage to William Cavendish. She had 8 children with Cavendish, and it's the descendants from this marriage who are important in Hobbes's life. Cavendish made a lot of money during the dissolution of the monasteries because he was a friend of Thomas Cromwell. But as soon as Mary became queen, Cavendish converted to Roman Catholicism and kept his job as treasurer of the royal chamber. Financial irregularities were discovered. He was embezzling. He died before Queen Mary could punish him. But death was not finished smiling on Bess. Mary died, and Bess's friend Elizabeth became queen. Bess married the wealthy William St. Lo, who became chief butler of England. He negotiated Bess's debt to the crown down to a fraction of the original amount owed. Also, Bess persuaded him to will his property to her and to her children, even though he had children from a previous marriage. Then he died. O death, where is thy victory? Bess had not lost her husband. She had gained more land and the opportunity for another marriage, her best one, to George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. She also managed to have her daughter marry Shrewsbury's oldest son, and one of her sons marry one of Shrewsbury's daughters. She was keeping the money all in the family. It would be easy to spend the rest of the hour on Bess, but we'd better kill her off at this point. She died just before Hobbes came to Chatsworth in 1608. He was hired ostensibly to tutor William Cavendish, one of Bess's grandsons. In fact, he was more like a boon companion. They hawked and drank together. Hobbes says that in his old age, he dreamt of those years and that they were the happiest times of his life. Hobbes and William took the grand tour of the continent probably in 1614. In Italy, they became acquainted with Fulgencio Mecanzio, the secretary to Venice's chief theorist in Venice's battle for religious independence against Rome. William and Macanzio corresponded for 13 years, from 1615 until 1628. The 30 Years' War was on, and Macanzio's main purpose, in my opinion, was to get William to influence King James to support the Protestant cause. When that did not succeed, Macanzio started praising Francis Bacon in his correspondence. He asked for help in establishing a correspondence with Bacon, and he did eventually establish that correspondence. Whatever admiration Macanzio had for Bacon's deep thoughts, I think he also wanted to use Bacon's influence, Bacon to influence the international policies of James I. Hobbes's role in all of this was to translate the letters for William from Italian into English. One more translation project should be mentioned. Hobbes's translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars was published in 1629. Because Thucydides was an opponent of democratic rule, and because the king was having troubles with Parliament, the translation was probably politically motivated. It was not unusual to make political points this obliquely. Although Hobbes praises William's love of learning, in fact, he was a happy-go-lucky ne'er-do-well. He gambled a lot, so much that he often sent Hobbes off to negotiate loans for him to pay his debts. He died prematurely in London at the age of 37. The cause? Aubrey said it was too much good living. William's widow Christian was left with a lot of land and just about as much debt. My guess is that she thought Hobbes was partially to blame. She dismissed him. A neighbor hired him to take his son on a grand tour, Hobbes' second. Hobbes was now in his mid-40s, so his experiences on this trip were different from those on the first one. The seeds of Hobbes' later philosophical work were planted. It's very likely that it was on this trip that Hobbes discovered geometry. Here's Aubrey's account of that event. Hobbes was in a gentleman's house in which a copy of Euclid's Elements lay open on a desk. When he read Proposition 47, that's the Pythagorean theorem, he said, "By God, this is impossible." So he read the demonstration of it, which referred him back to such a proposition. Which proposition he read? Et sic deinceps, that at last he was demonstratively convinced of that truth. This made him in love with geometry. Hobbes was so intoxicated by geometry that he devised the project of giving a geometrical demonstration of all reality. For Hobbes, the only thing that exists is matter in motion. The only way that one thing causes another is by moving it. And the only way of moving something is by contact. There's no action at a distance. And the entire course of the universe was determined by the first state of its existence. In short, he was an uncompromising materialist, mechanist, and determinist. Everything, he thought, including human beings and government, is explainable in terms of matter in motion. When Hobbes returned to England, he and Christian must have reconciled because she hired him to tutor her son William, the third Earl of Devonshire. He went on his third grand tour between 1634 and 1636. It was by far the most important intellectually because it put him into the company of some of the leading scientists of the time, Marin Mersenne, Pierre Gassendi, and Gilles Parson de Roberval. As a result of his friendship with Mersenne, Hobbes was invited to contribute to the set of objections that accompanied René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. Hobbes's objections and Descartes' replies constitute one of the great examples in the history of philosophy of talking past one another. Hobbes the materialist versus Descartes the dualist. Hobbes, who thought that even God was material, versus Descartes, who thought that that view was so outrageous that he refused to comment on it. One of the most famous lines in philosophy is Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Hobbes was not impressed. He said that Descartes might just as well have argued ambulo ergo sum. I walk, therefore I am. Hobbes's response was insulting and apparently obtuse. To say I think is to make it true. To say I walk is not thereby to make it true, as I'm proving right now. The animosity between Hobbes and Descartes had started earlier when Hobbes had commented on Descartes' discourse on the method of rightly conducting the mind. And about Hobbes's commentary, Descartes wrote to Mersenne the following: I was very surprised by the fact that Hobbes seems to stray from the truth in every single claim he advances. Hobbes returned the favor. He said that if Descartes, quote, had kept to geometry, he would have been the best geometer in the world, but that his head does not lie for philosophy. When Hobbes got back to England in 1636, he switched employment from the Cavendishes of Chatsworth to the Cavendishes of Welbeck. The head of this side of the family was the future Duke of Newcastle, the guy who lost the Battle of Marston Moor. He was another grandson of Bess. His name? William Cavendish, of course. I'll call him Newcastle. Newcastle had his own scientific circle, and its members corresponded with members of Mersenne's circle. Newcastle may have invited Descartes to live with him at one point. How the history of philosophy would have been different if Hobbes and Descartes had lived together. We're now entering the period of Hobbes's great philosophical work. In the late 1630s, he devised a plan to present the truth about everything in three parts. Part 1, De Corpore, would discuss language, logic, mathematics, and science. Part 2, De Homine, would discuss the physiology and psychology of human beings. In fact, more than half of it is about optics. Part 3, De Cive, would discuss the origin and nature of government. As things turned out, Hobbes published his political views first and his views about human beings last. His first effort at political theory resulted in a manuscript, The Elements of Law, Natural and Politic. It was circulated in London just about the time of the Short Parliament. It supported absolute sovereignty. The king's enemies didn't like that, but luckily for Hobbes, the king dissolved Parliament. The Long Parliament opened in November, and some royalists were arrested. Hobbes feared that there would be more, and that he might be one of them. He thought his situation was dire enough to flee the continent in late November 1640, the first of those who fled, as I mentioned earlier. Hobbes set himself up in Paris, an honored intellectual in exile and a member of Mersenne's circle. In 1642, Hobbes published the first edition of De Cive. It was a hit. A second expanded edition was published 5 years later. Here's Hobbes's political philosophy in a nutshell. To make it easier to understand, I'm going to distinguish between a primary and a secondary state of nature, even though Hobbes does not use these terms and doesn't make that distinction. The primary state of nature is the condition of human beings when there's no law of any kind, no law at all. In particular, there are no laws made by human beings and no moral laws of nature either. In the primary state of nature, everyone has a right to everything, because law is the thing that imposes restrictions on behavior. No laws, no restrictions. So in the state of nature, conflict is inevitable. There are three causes of it: competition, diffidence, that means distrust, and the love of glory. First, people compete for the same goods. Suppose there's an apple here and two or more of us want it. Each has a right to the apple because there's no laws against anything, but only one of us can have it. Conflict. Second, people accumulate things in the state of nature. Hobbes has a great list: wives, children, and cattle. There are no laws to protect these possessions from other people, and those other people have as much right to those things as the person who possesses them. Possession may be 9/10 of the law, but since there are no laws in the state of nature, possession counts for nothing. So no one can trust his fellow man to leave his things alone. Again, conflict. Third, it makes most people happy to have other people think well of them. This is love of glory. But if one person gets glory, then another person gives it. And to Hobbes, the one who gets is superior to the one who gives. Now, this desire for glory violates a basic fact about life in the state of nature, namely that no one is better than anyone else. Everyone is equal. Why does Hobbes think this? Because everyone has an equal ability, either alone or in the company of others, to take away from another person what is most important to that person, his life. In short, the desire for glory results in conflict. I've just talked about three simple sources of conflict in the state of nature. Things are even worse than I've let on, because each person in the state of nature knows that every other person is suspicious of his behavior. So it's rational for every person to be even more suspicious, because he knows that other people are suspicious of him and thus will be inclined to misinterpret his innocent actions or to launch preemptive attacks on him. I've been using the word conflict to discuss the problems in the state of nature, but another word is justified, and it's a word that Hobbes uses, war. The state of nature is a war of all against all, because war, as Hobbes says, doesn't consist just in actual fighting, but of any situation in which a person can't be sure that he won't be attacked. Now, intuitively, peace is prior to war, but for Hobbes, just the opposite is the case. War is the natural condition of human beings, he says. All other time is peace. One of the reasons that Hobbes is a popular political philosopher today is that his theory seems to describe international relations very nicely. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in the Cold War, probably the most dangerous time in history, even though each side hardly fired a shot at the other. Why were they at war? Because natural resources are scarce, because neither side trusted the other, and each wanted the glory of being the strongest and the best. That's how we got to the moon in the first place. We just wanted to get more glory than the Soviet Union in doing it. Obviously, we're not in the state of nature, so there must be some way out of it. How does it happen? Well, when we were describing the state of nature, we were really doing a thought experiment. We were imagining what life would be like if there were no laws at all. Now, in fact, it's not true that the primary state of nature ever actually exists anywhere. The reason is that there are moral laws of nature which are eternal and immutable. So the laws of nature always exist whenever the state of nature exists, and they're discoverable by reason. So the next stage in explaining the origin of government is to add the concept of the laws of nature to the concept of the primary state of nature, and the result is the secondary state of nature. People still exist in a dangerous situation, but at least they have information that can lead them out of the danger into the safety of a civil state. Hobbes' laws of nature describe a very conventional morality. Thank those who do nice things for you. That's law number 4. Accommodate yourself to other people. That's number 5. Pardon those who have hurt you. Don't hate other people. Don't be proud or arrogant. I haven't mentioned the first 3 laws of nature yet, but they're the most important ones. First, all people want peace. Second, each person is willing to lay down his right to all things for the sake of peace, as long as everyone else is willing to do the same. Third, people keep their covenants. Now remember, these are laws. They don't state how they state how people ought to act. They aren't descriptions of how people always do act. Hobbes does not explicitly prove any of these laws, but I don't think they're hard to prove. The first follows from the definition of a law of nature. Here's the definition. A law of nature is a precept or rule, so it's something that's action guiding, found out by reason. That's the way the law is promulgated, through our natural reason, which forbids a person from doing anything that threatens his life. Now, the last clause is the most important one. The definition of the law of nature forbids a person to do anything that threatens his life. Now let's prove the first law, that people want peace. We'll use the technique of reductio ad absurdum to do it. Suppose that a person does not want peace. then that person will be doing something that threatens his life because he won't be acting to get out of the state of nature. And the state of nature is inherently dangerous. This consequence contradicts the definition of the law of nature. Don't do anything that threatens your life. Therefore, the opposite is true, namely, all people want peace. QED. Now consider the second law. We again proceed by reductio ad absurdum. Suppose that people are not willing to lay down their right to all things. Then people do not want peace, because the right to all things is a cause of war. But this contradicts the first law, all people want peace, therefore the supposition is false, and the second law of nature is true. QED again. The first law of nature, in effect, gives the overriding aim of all the other laws of nature: establish peace. The others provide the means to that end. The first thing to do is to lay down your right to all things. There are now moral restrictions on your behavior, but that doesn't guarantee security. People don't always keep their obligations. What's needed is someone to protect you and everyone else. This happens if the way each person lays down her right is by transferring them to some one other person or group of people. And that person does not lay down his rights. That person is the sovereign. He gets all the rights of the people who covenant to make a government, and hence gets all the power of those people. Because when you transfer your right, you're also transferring your power to that person. The people who make the covenant incur obligations, but the sovereign incurs none because he doesn't covenant with anyone. He keeps all of his rights, and in addition gets the use of the power of the people who have made him their sovereign. This creation of the sovereign is made possible by the third law of nature. You keep your covenants. There's no backing out once you've entered the civil government. When Hobbes says, when Hobbes talks about a sovereign, it's important to realize that the sovereign is an artificial person, a person made by the people who create the government. The artificial person may consist of a single natural person, that's monarchy, or several people, that's aristocracy, or all the people, that's democracy, and it's the least stable form of government, because what you want to do in getting out of the state of nature is take away the power from each individual person. There are all sorts of complexities in and problems with Hobbes's view, but it's best if we pass over them now. Leviathan was published in 1651. It contained a lot of views that were directly opposed to Roman Catholicism, and some views that the exiled English priests did not like either. Fearing reprisals, Hobbes left France and returned to England. He was a famous intellectual, having some reputation as a mathematician, some reputation as a scientist, and now a great reputation as a political theorist because of De Quive and Leviathan, and getting a controversial reputation as a religious thinker. Leviathan, I think, deserves to be called a Bible for modern man, because no other work of the 17th century gives such a forceful, eloquent, and comprehensive statement of the doctrines that capture the spirit of modern thought. At the very least, Leviathan has great pretensions. Let's think just about the first clause of the introduction to Leviathan. Nature is the art whereby God hath made and governs the world. It's possible that Hobbes is imitating the beginning of the book of Genesis. Genesis says, in the beginning, God created nature, the heavens and the earth. Notice that Hobbes reverses the order of God and nature. He mentions nature first. He doesn't deny the existence of God, but he thinks that humans know nothing more about him than that he exists and that he's omnipotent. So Hobbes is taking one of the first steps both to humanism and deism. To paraphrase Alexander Pope, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is nature, of which man is a part. Also notice that in the opening clause, Hobbes says that nature is artificial. He can say this because whatever is made by a person is artificial, and God's a person. In other words, Hobbes is deconstructing one of the most basic dichotomies in the history of thought, the distinction between art and nature. Other deconstructions follow fast. Machines are alive because they move on their own. Human beings are machines because hearts are pumps and legs are wheels. And human beings create just as God creates. God says, let there be men, and there are men. Men say, let there be a government, and there is a government. Later, Hobbes says that Leviathan, that is the government, is, quote, a mortal god to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. As Hobbes works it out, the sovereign has all the properties traditionally attributed to God. Omniscience, because the sovereign determines the truth of any disputed proposition. Omnipotence, because he has irresistible power. Omnibenevolence, because the will of the sovereign determines what is good for all subjects. And he's all just, because the sovereign makes all the laws and judges all cases. Here's the most important characteristic of all, in my opinion. The sovereign is the redeemer. In Judeo-Christian thought, people need to be redeemed for two reasons. One, the world is radically defective. This is Hobbes' state of nature. And two, people can't help themselves. And in the state of nature, people can't help themselves. They're in constant danger of death. But the sovereign gets people out of the state of nature and protects them. So the sovereign is the redeemer. Think about all the things that the modern state provides for people from birth, in fact, from prenatal care to death, and I think you'll see that the state has become a secular redeemer. Hobbes is the first great exponent of that view. During the 1650s, Hobbes hung around with some of the best people, and after the Restoration, these included the king. Here's Aubrey's report of a meeting between Hobbes and Charles II. It happened about 2 or 3 days after His Majesty's happy return that as he was passing in his coach through the Strand, Mr. Hobbes was standing at Little Salisbury House gate. The king espied him, put off his hat very kindly to him, and asked him how he did. About a week after, he had an oral conference with His Majesty, where, as he sat for his picture, he was diverted by Mr. Hobbes's pleasant discourse. Here, His Majesty's favors were reintegrated to him, and order was given that he should have free access to His Majesty, who was always much delighted in his wit and smart repartees. The wits at court were wont to bait him, but he feared none of them and would make his part good. The king would call him the bear. Here comes the bear to be baited. Very nice. But most of Hobbes's time in the 1650s and 60s was spent fighting, and he fought with some of the best, especially Robert Boyle and John Wallace. Boyle, who gave his name to the gas laws, was doing important research on the vacuum. He improved on a piece of experimental equipment that was invented in the Netherlands, the air pump. I'll show you a picture of the air pump. I'm not a very good artist, but there's a large glass globe, and the largest of these contained, or had a capacity of 5 quarts. And then there's a narrow glass neck, and into the neck is a brass stopcock. Then there's a cylinder with a piston inside and a valve here. So you open the stopcock, pull back the piston, air rushes in. You close the stopcock, reinsert the piston with the valve open, and the air is vented. And you repeat this process until you create a vacuum. Hobbes had 2 basic kinds of objection to the experiment. The first concerned the apparatus itself. In general, Hobbes did not like using instruments in science. He said, quote, "Not everyone that brings from beyond the seas a new gin or other jaunty device is therefore a philosopher. For if that's what you think, not only apothecaries and gardeners, but many other workmen will put in for being a philosopher and win the prize." What's needed, according to Hobbes, is better thinking, not more equipment. He pointed out that Boyle was not taking into account the possibility that air was leaking back into the globe where the cylinder and the stopcock joined together. And also not taking into account the possibility that there is very fine air that can pass through glass. So out goes the gross air, in comes the fine air. Hobbes's arguments were pretty good. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Boyle's device worked just the way he said it did. The other kind of objection that Hobbes had concerned the very nature of science. For Hobbes, science should be essentially non-empirical or a priori in character. He thought that science should consist of definitions. For example, definitions of body, motion, force, things like that. As definitions, they are true by stipulation. I think that this is part of Hobbes's refutation or a solution to skepticism. We can't be wrong about definitions because they're true by their very nature, true by stipulation. The scientist should derive truths from the definitions and then more truths from the derived propositions. This is the proper method of science. Hobbes thought that nature itself provided enough phenomena to test scientific theories, such things as tides, eclipses, and comets. It wasn't necessary to construct machines and instruments for that purpose. What about John Wallis? He was the most important English mathematician before Newton. He introduced analytic geometry into England, extended the infinitesimal calculus, and invented the familiar sign for infinity, the lazy 8. Hobbes had grave reservations about analytic geometry, partly because Descartes had invented it, partly because he couldn't understand the symbols. He calls Wallis's Arithmetica Infinitorum a scab of symbols, and partly because the underlying theory was inconsistent with his own materialism. For every mathematician except Hobbes, points, lines, plane figures, and so on are abstract objects, never perfectly instantiated in physical reality. In contrast, for Hobbes, all genuine entities are first of all material entities. So he thought that even points and lines had both length and breadth. Hobbes undeniably lost the mathematical war. He claimed that he had succeeded in solving a 2,000-year-old puzzle, squaring the circle. That is, constructing a square that has the same area as a given circle. No one had done it, and it was not until the 19th century that a proof was given that it can't be done. In the 17th century, it was still an open question. He showed his proof around, and he got criticisms back. At first, the criticisms were polite. Hobbes says that the criticisms were niggling and easily avoided. He sent back revised proofs. But they contained errors too. The critics became irritated. Hobbes became more irritated than they and sent back new, improved, invalid proofs. The critics became incensed. It was probably Hobbes's worst time. In these disputes, Hobbes was not just attacking Boyle and Wallis. He was attacking the group that they belonged to, the Royal Society. Hobbes wanted in and thought that he ought to be in because he knew more than anybody else. In a letter to the Royal Society, he said that the scientists should stop wasting their time with experiments and start deducing more propositions from the definitions and theorems that he had supplied in De Corpore, his own work. He was ignored. One member, John Owen, reportedly said, "Whatever be Hobbes's doctrine, we will not accept it." So it became all the more important to Hobbes to prove that he was right and everybody else disagreeing with him was wrong. His desire for glory led him to make war on the Royal Society. A large part of the blame should be pinned on Hobbes himself. He used to go to proto-coffee houses, so Starbucks before Starbucks existed. and presented his views at these gatherings of intellectuals. When someone would object to his doctrine, Hobbes would stand up and say, "I come to teach, not to dispute," and then walk out. It's well known that the leaders of the restored Church of England were oppressive enough during the 1660s without needing a losing war, the Second Dutch War, a plague, and a fire to inflame their bigotry. These disasters of the mid-1660s caused some people to blame their own sinfulness. But it was more popular to blame the sinfulness of others. Roman Catholics, atheists, and in one case, a Roman Catholic atheist. That was Thomas White, a friend and enemy of Hobbes. In October 1666, a bill was introduced against atheism and profanity. Hobbes was to be investigated. The matter was referred to committee, which, so far as we know, never reported. Individual thinkers, notably Bishop John Brommel, also accused Hobbes of atheism. The debate between them had begun in Paris when they were both in exile during the English Civil War. The issue was free will. Brommel defended it, and Hobbes attacked it. The debate between Hobbes and Brommel is complex, but to express its essence very briefly, I would say it comes down to this. Brommel believed in a universe that was causally open to non-mechanical causes. So God, for example, can intervene and create a miracle, but every time you exercise free will, you're introducing something new into the world. Brommel's view is the commonsensical and the old-fashioned view. In contrast, seeing the implications of the new science, Hobbes thought that the universe was a closed system. The only kind of causality is mechanical, one body moving another body. This means that there can't be free will as traditionally understood. According to Hobbes, an act of will is the last desire you have before acting. And that desire is caused by preceding desires or something else just as physical. For Hobbes, it's perfectly true to say that a person or his action is free. Freedom exists when the action is caused by the normal operation of a desire, rather than some violent external force. So people and actions are free, even though free will does not exist. Hobbes did not take the charges of atheism, formal or informal, lying down. He defended himself in several works, notably Considerations upon the Reputation, Loyalty, Manners, and Religion of Thomas Hobbes. The title of Brommel's book, The Catching of the Leviathan, may remind us of Herman Melville's piscatorial tale, with Brommel playing Captain Ahab to Hobbes's Moby Dick. My sympathies are with the big fish. By the early 1670s, Hobbes had had enough. At the age of 84, he left London for good and returned to the estates of the estates of the Chatsworth Cavendishes. There he returned to the kind of work he had done 40 years earlier, translation. His version of books 8 through 12 of the Odyssey was published in 1673. It was well received, so he published the entire Odyssey in 1675 and the Iliad in 1676. He became ill for the last time in October 1679. Near the end of November, the Cavendishes were preparing for their usual move from Chatsworth to Hardwicke for the Christmas holidays. The family did not want to move him, but he didn't want to die alone. So he was wrapped in a feather comforter and placed in a coach for the 10-mile ride to Hardwicke. Hobbes had often said that death is the greatest evil that can befall a person, but at the end of his verse autobiography, written when he was 84, he said, "Et prope stans, dictat mors mihi, ne metue," and death, standing close to me, says, "Do not be afraid." He died on Thursday, December 4th, 1679. His body was wrapped in a woolen shroud and placed in a casket. The casket was carried to the nearby church. The minister of the church conducted the service, which was attended by the Cavendish family and neighbors. He was buried inside the church, a sign of great honor. Much of what he did was motivated by fear. He fled England when he was afraid of being killed in the English Civil War. He fled France when he was afraid of the Roman Catholic clergy and the English clergy in exile. He feared prosecution for atheism during the Commonwealth and the Restoration. He came to fear the loss of his reputation as a mathematician. He battled the most important members of the Royal Society because he feared the loss of his glory. Much of his time was spent in fear of war. All other time was peace. Thank you. Should we go right into questions? Yep.
You're saying that Hobbes said that people and actions are free, even though free will does not exist, but I didn't follow your reasoning.
The reasoning?
For that.
Right. Hobbes gives a different criterion for understanding what freedom is going to be. Freedom, or an action or a person is going to be free as long as what that person does is caused in the normal way. So there are laws about what kinds of desires will cause other desires, which eventually cause us to act. As long as that normal chain of causation occurs, we call the action free. There isn't any special spiritual act of will that causes the action. Okay, so there's no free will. An action is free as long as you're not compelled by some external force, like the wind blowing you over. Now, if Hobbes was a little more sophisticated, he could have thrown in problems with your internal chemistry, okay, because we know about psychiatry these days, but he didn't. So he only thought of deviant external causes interfering with freedom. Yes?
What are the current debated issues in Hobbes' studies for philosophers that are most interesting to you?
Good question. I think the single biggest debate is whether Hobbes was an atheist or not an atheist. The dominant view is that Hobbes either was an atheist or possibly he was a deist, that is somebody who believes in God but doesn't think that God interacts with the world in any way, doesn't have providence over the world. And these same people typically think that he was trying to undermine Christian thought. So he was really anti-religious. The other side is the side that I'm on, believes that Hobbes was a genuine Christian thinker who was trying to meet the challenge of modern science. So in the 17th century, modern science looked like it was going to displace Christianity. It looked like you had a choice. You're either going to continue to be religious and give up modern science or not accept it, or you accept modern science and you give up Christianity. Now, I think that Hobbes attempted to reinterpret or reconceptualize Christian doctrine to make room for modern science. Now, I think that his effort failed, and because his contemporaries saw that it failed, they thought that he was really trying to subvert religion. So they take much of what Hobbes says as being sarcastic or expressing a secret doctrine. I take Hobbes more at his word and think that he was sincere in trying to solve these problems and didn't carry it off. Yeah.
Do there remain, let's call them textual problems of the integrity of the text at all, or not?
Well, it's not a matter of the integrity of the text. The problem is that Hobbes often changed his mind or seems to have said different things about a topic. And so when you interpret Hobbes, you have to make a decision about how much weight you ought to give to one statement or another. And I think that Hobbes' philosophy contains a lot of contradictions, and so you have to try to figure out which one would best fit what he really wanted to do. So it's a tough problem.
Could ask you, Al, about Hobbes's idea of the state and how this has stood the test of time over the centuries. And the reason I ask is that historians have appropriated the idea of the Leviathan and have transformed it into the idea of the colonial state that is all-encompassing, which has the impulse and the urge to control everything that all of its subjects does at all times.
Good question. I think that in the literature, that question is put in a slightly different way, so let me try to do that, answer it in the more traditional way. There's a big question about whether Hobbes is a liberal political theorist or not. Now, we're not talking about Democrats and Republicans. We're talking about the role that liberty and freedom plays in Hobbes's philosophy. Now, if you're a liberal political theorist, what you want to end up with is as much freedom for citizens as possible. Because political philosophers want to end up with freedom, they often begin with freedom and claim that we're completely free in the state of nature. Now, Hobbes is a difficult case because he begins with freedom in the state of nature, but he says that freedom is a dreadful condition because if you're absolutely free, there are no constraints on anyone and no order. Everyone is at war with everyone else. So he says we have to get out of this state of absolute freedom. People do that by laying down their rights to all things. Now, that phrase is ambiguous. What does it mean to lay down your right to all things? Does it mean that you lay down some of your rights to a sovereign so that you can preserve the rest of your rights and be free? Or does it mean that you give up all of your rights? Well, when Hobbes wants to make his theory plausible and attractive, he gives it the first interpretation. You just lay down some of your rights. But Hobbes wants to end up with absolute sovereignty. He wants the sovereign to have power over every aspect of life. And in those cases, he interprets giving up the right to all things in the second way. So Hobbes is a difficult person in the history of liberal theory. He begins the right way, but liberals are very unhappy with the way he ends.
Oh, I was very interested. I come from a literary background. I was wondering about this sort of tension between the mode of his argument, the insistence upon these highly materialist determinist procedures, and what looks to be a series, if we take your reading, of abstract destinations at which he hopes to arrive, if he is a Christian thinker, if he does want to justify monarchy, for example. Could you talk a little bit about why he seems to choose procedures that result in him arguing that there is a finer sort of gas, a kind of very concrete debate that clearly puts at risk some of the broader issues that he wants to address?
Ouch, that's a tough one. Let me begin by saying that I think that Hobbes had a bit of intellectual perversity. There's a letter that still exists in which he says, I put forward paradoxical positions. People misunderstand the implications of it, but I show that I'm right, you know. Okay, so there's something about his attempt to dazzle you. He's smarter than everyone else. For the rest of the answer, I guess I have to say that he says what he does because he believes it's true. That is, he does believe that anything that exists has to be material. That also leads him to be very dubious that there is any such thing as a vacuum or a void. The world is completely filled. But he also wants to get to absolute sovereignty. Now, why does he want to get there? I mean, I don't know what there is in his psychology that drove him in that direction. But that's where he wanted to get to, so by gosh, he got there. I don't think that's the most satisfactory answer, but I'm really not sure what the correct answer is.
Probably true, not satisfactory.
Yes.
How much time did he spend with Gassendi in Gassendi influenced him to skepticism in any way?
Well, Hobbes liked Gassendi a whole lot. In one of his later letters to the Royal Society, Hobbes denied that Gassendi had any influence on him at all. In 1647, Hobbes became seriously ill and thought he was going to die. And Mersenne comes to him and says, "Look, Thomas, you're on your deathbed. Can't I convert you to the Roman Catholic faith right now?" And Hobbes says, "I've been through all of that a long time ago, Mersenne. Please don't bother me with it. How is my friend Gassendi?" So he did have this affectionate relationship with Gassendi. Whether there was an influence or not, I don't know. Certainly Hobbes denied that there was. I think I wanted to say one more thing about that.
Montaigne was influenced by Gassendi somewhat, I think.
Montaigne influenced Gassendi? Yes.
By Gassendi.
Montaigne's
In
earlier.
his skepticism.
Montaigne's earlier. Montaigne is 16th century. Gassendi, 17th century.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I believe that Montaigne did influence Gassendi to some extent, although Gassendi was more influenced by Epicurus.
Professor Gonzalez Girth.
Thank you. Well, the history of Western philosophy, like the history of Western literature and so forth, is usually, I guess for practical reasons, divided in national philosophies or literatures or so forth, in spite of the fact that the word got across, even though long before the internet, and there were, like, as you pointed out, influences and relations of different sorts. And so, as you pointed out, Italy, France, England, Germany, and so on. Nevertheless, although I think in the whole of your talk you have really focused on this, and Roger's question also did about the state, but in order to sharpen the whole thing, in sum and in brief, could you say something about what you see to be the position of Hobbes insofar as English philosophy is concerned? Is it simply materialism or what?
Not just materialism, because I think the successor to Hobbes in English philosophy is John Locke. John Locke takes over Hobbes's idea of the state of nature, but he makes it a lot more attractive. John Locke's state of nature is a condition where most people are pretty nice, and the reason why we have to get a government is because there's a few people who aren't nice, so he softens it. And Locke is not a materialist. He believes in the soul, things like that. So I do think that Hobbes influences political philosophy in England through Locke, and then later in the philosophy of David Hume. Hume is very interesting because he's always criticizing Hobbes. Oh, Hobbes is wrong about this, Hobbes is wrong about that. But he then uses Hobbes's theory without acknowledging that he gets it from him. To give a general comment, I think it's hard to place Hobbes in a general context in English philosophy for this reason, that Hobbes has some elements that are very empirical and other elements that are very rationalist. And so it's not very easy to say whether he's an empirical philosopher or a rationalistic philosopher. One more thing, in terms of the philosophy of religion, Hobbes, I think, influenced Locke again, but Locke, again, tried to smooth over the rough spots. And then Locke had a follower whose name escapes me at the moment, who draws deistic conclusions from Locke's premises, and Locke protests that this is a complete misrepresentation of his view. But I think that Hobbes starts this movement from theism in the modern period to deism, eventually to atheism, somebody like David Hume.
we have time for a couple of concluding questions or comments.
Mary?
If this is not too anachronistic an idea, what would Hobbes have to say about weakness of the will or acrasia, which would seem to affect his concern?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
The question was, what would Hobbes say about weakness of will or acrasia? He doesn't say anything, and I can't guess what he might say about it. I mean, I wonder if he would say that because everything is determined, the notion of weakness of will doesn't matter. I'm just not sure.
Yes.
You said that his philosophy derives from mechanics and that motion or change is a direct result of contact. How does he reconcile magnetism and gravity in that?
This is a good question to end on because I don't remember, in fact, I don't really think I ever understood his view about magnetism and gravity. All I know is that it wasn't right. And we had to wait for Isaac Newton to get the right answer.
Al, thank you very much for a great afternoon.
A.P. Martinich teaches philosophy at the University of Texas, where this event was held. He has written or edited 9 other books. Hobbes, a biography, is published by Cambridge University